Hello. Today, you will be listening to John Lewis Esposito talking about women and change in Islam from the Great World Religion series.
The status of women in Islam is a hotly contested issue, both in the Muslim world and in the West. Muslim women are often viewed through Western stereotypes, or the policies of extremists like the Taliban in Afghanistan. Gender in Islam remains a highly charged issue today at the popular level and among scholars and religious leaders. If some blame Islam for the oppression of women, others see it as a beacon of light and reform. Still others insist that the status and role of women in Muslim societies should be attributed primarily to socioeconomic forces, to patriarchy, rather than religious belief. The explanations are as diverse as the Muslim world itself. Thus, charting the progress or regression of women, whether under secular or religious governments, is a tricky task. While some claim that Islam oppresses women, others view Islam as a source of women's empowerment. The diversity of practice is reflected in dress, access to education, and professional positions, and the visibility and roles of women across time and space. The veil has become a particularly charged symbol. Yet even the wearing of the veil has diverse meanings for the wearers and the observers. Increasingly, Muslim women today are struggling to forge new paths, reinterpreting the Quran and Muslim traditions, taking their place in education and the professions, seeking to improve their status both within the family and as professionals. For several decades, women in Muslim societies have been part of the dialectics of change, an erratic and vacillating and contradictory process that creates many anomalies and contradictions. Evidence of women's status represents great diversity across the Muslim world. In some Muslim countries, women drive cars, ride motorcycles, hold professional positions in virtually every sector, serve as ambassadors and parliamentary members and judges, outnumber men at universities, and have the right to vote. In others, they need a male's permission to travel, cannot drive a car, are sexually segregated, must be completely covered in public, cannot vote, are restricted by Islamic laws that severely limit their rights in marriage, divorce, and inheritance, that condemn them to be stoned to death if found guilty of fornication or adultery. The following examples give some sense of the complexity and anomalies of gender relations in the Muslim world. And here I'm going to refer to anomalies that existed recently. Some of them have passed recently from the scene, but they're all within the last couple of decades. And you'll note how some countries seem very progressive on many things, but not on other things, and vice versa. In Egypt, long regarded, and indeed one of the most modernizing of Muslim states, women cannot serve as judges, yet they can be members of parliament, they have been in the cabinet. Yet in Morocco, more than 20% of the judges are women. Women in Egypt and Malaysia have access to the best education, hold responsible professional positions in virtually every sector. Yet, like women in many Muslim societies, they had needed a male relative's permission to travel. Women in Saudi Arabia own much of the real estate in Riyadh and Jeddah, can own businesses, but cannot drive a car, are sexually segregated, and restricted to appropriate professions, much as women in the West had to deal with that themselves. Certain professions, teaching, nursing, etc., for example, in the West being seen in the past as more appropriate than being a corporate executive. In nearby Kuwait, women function in society, hold responsible positions in many areas, but have not been able to get the vote. More recently, there has been a move to sexually segregate universities. That is, students in universities. In Iran, which we think of often as a fundamentalist state, where women must wear the chador in public, women constitute the majority of students in universities, hold professional positions, and serve in parliament. Moreover, the Islamic Republic of Iran has had a woman vice president. Though Pakistani women can vote, serve as ambassadors to the United States, and even as prime minister, they, particularly the poor and powerless, also suffer under Islamic laws, or so-called Islamic laws, enacted by General Zia-ul-Haq in the past, but still enforced today. In Afghanistan, the Taliban, in the name of Islam, required women to wear the chador, forced professional women to give up their jobs, and prohibited girls from attending school. Such contradictions are also evident in the issue of veiling. If many associate the veil with the oppression of women, others say veiling preserves women's dignity, freedom, and modesty. The Islamic style of dress is known by many names: hijab, burqa, chador. Veiling ranges from wearing a headscarf to covering the entire body and face. A multitude of styles, colors, and fabrics are worn by Muslim women in countries extending from Morocco to Iran to Malaysia to Europe and the United States, and because of diverse customs and interpretations of the Quranic verses. Veiling of women did not become widespread in early Islam until 3 or 4 generations after the death of Muhammad. Veiling was originally a sign of honor and distinction, not oppression. During Muhammad's time, Muhammad's wives and upper-class women wore the veil as a symbol of their status. Generations later, Muslim women adopted the practice more widely. They were influenced by upper and middle-class Persian and Byzantine women, who wore the veil as a sign of their rank to separate themselves, not from men, but from the lower classes. The mingling of all classes at prayer and in the marketplace encouraged use of the veil among urban Muslim women. Since the 1970s, a significant number of modern women from Cairo to Jakarta have turned or returned to wearing Islamic dress. Often this is a voluntary movement led by young, urban, middle-class women who are well-educated and work in every sector of society. And ironically, they have often been the daughters of women a generation before who, as it were, threw off the veil in order to turn to and wear Western dress. In many cases, the process is distinctly modern, with new fashions and styles encompassing new understandings of the status and role of women, fashions that are sold in boutiques. Such women are not passive victims of male-imposed mores, but active agents for change. Some who wear Islamic dress believe that they are able to function as active, self-directed, independent subjects, commanding respect, acknowledged and treated as persons, rather than sex objects. Western and Muslim critics of Islamic dress, on the other hand, question those who say it is their free choice to wear the veil. They see such women as under the sway of an oppressive patriarchal culture, or as just submitting to the dictates of their religion or the particular brand of religion taught in their country or community. They also say that after seeing the hijab used to control and segregate women, as in Afghanistan under the Taliban, the rest of the world perceives the veil as a symbol of conformity and confinement that reflects on any women who wear it. Some Muslims, however, contend that Western women only believe that they are free. They do not see how their culture exploits them when they choose to spend their countless hours on their appearance, wear uncomfortable skin-tight clothes and dangerous high-heeled shoes, and allow themselves to be displayed as sexual objects to sell cars, shaving cream, and beer. These Muslims say that Westerners condemn the veil because they themselves are not free to choose. Women who wear the scarf complain that instead of asking what the hijab means to them, people simply assume that veiled women are oppressed. This assumption, they say, oppresses Muslim women more than any manner of dress ever could. Even if a woman wearing the veil is strong and intelligent, people who are reluctant to get to know or invite her to participate in activities automatically discount her value. They point out that women of many other cultures and religions, Russian women, Hindu women, Jewish women, Greek women, Catholic nuns, have worn head coverings. They ask why these women are not viewed as oppressed. If opponents assume that women of other cultures who cover their heads are liberated, why can't they imagine freedom for Muslim women who wear a veil? Muslim women often talk about what the hijab symbolizes to them: religious devotion, discipline, reflection, respect, freedom, and modernity. Being valued for who they are rather than what they look like. Islamic dress is also used as a sign of protest and liberation. It has developed political overtones, becoming a source of national pride and resistance to Western cultural and political dominance and authoritarian regimes. It existed from the Algerian independence movement in the 60s to the Iranian Revolution 1978-79 and beyond. While women's status in Muslim countries has long been seen as evidence of Islam's oppression of women, the reality is far more complex. As we have seen before, the revelation of Islam raised the status of women by prohibiting female infanticide, abolishing women's status as property, establishing women's legal capacity, granting women the right to receive their own dowry, changing marriage from a proprietary to a contractual relationship, and allowing women to retain control over their property, and in many cultures to use their maiden name after marriage. The Quran also granted women financial maintenance from their husbands and control the husband's free ability to divorce. Now again, I must remind you that over time, in many societies, these rights were in fact ignored or circumvented. The Quran declares that men and women are equal in the eyes of God. Man and women were created to be equal parts of a pair, the Quran states in chapter 51, verse 49. It describes the relationship between men and women as one of love and mercy. Chapter 30, verse 21. Men and women are to be like, quote, members of one another, close quote. Chapter 3, verse 195. Like each other's garment. Chapter 2, verse 187. Men and women in Islam are equally responsible for adhering to the 5 pillars of Islam. This is stated clearly in the Quran. The believers, men and women, are protectors of one another. They enjoin what is just and forbid what is evil. They observe regular prayers, pay zakat, and obey God and His messenger. God will pour His mercy on them, for God is exalted in power, wise. God has promised to believers, men and women, gardens under which rivers flow to dwell therein. This verse draws added significance from the fact, as I pointed out in one of our first lectures, that it was the last Quran verse to be revealed that addressed relations between men and women. Thus, as we noted earlier, some scholars argue on the basis of both content and chronology that this verse outlines the ideal vision of the relationship between men and women in Islam, one of equality and complementarity. Needless to say, this is a contended issue within Islam and within Muslim communities. But if this is the case, why are there problems with the status of women in Muslim countries? Most Muslim societies have been patriarchal, and women have long been considered to be the culture bearers within their societies. The Quran, Hadith, traditions of the Prophet, and Islamic law have long been interpreted by men in these patriarchal societies. One need only think of the way in which the role of women in Christianity and Judaism, as in Hinduism and Buddhism, was affected by patriarchy and the fact that it was, as I like to put it, the good old boys who did the reinterpreting, and often continue to in some instances. Women, from the Prophet's wives to scholars and Sufi mystics, have exercised leadership at different points in history. Yet in practice, patriarchy prevailed, as men functioned as the primary political, religious, and intellectual leaders. And women were often marginalized in the mosque and in public space. Reformers have argued that traditional interpretations of Quranic verses favoring men need reinterpretation in light of the new social, cultural, and economic realities in the 20th and 21st centuries. Quranic interpretation is at the center of many debates. One controversial verse is Quran chapter 4, verse 34, which says, men have responsibility for and priority over women. Since God has given some of them advantages over others, and because they should spend their wealth for the support of women. Contrary to many traditional interpretations, contemporary scholars have noted that the priority referred to in this verse is based upon men's socioeconomic responsibilities for women. It does not say women are incapable of managing their own affairs. They further argue that nowhere in the Quran does it say explicitly that all men are superior to, preferred to, or better than all women. God's expressed preference for certain individuals in the Quran is based upon their faith, not their gender. Another controversial Quranic stipulation can be found in chapter 2, verse 282, is that 2 female witnesses are equal to 1 male witness. And this gets reasserted today in a number of modern Muslim states, though certainly not all. Over time, this was interpreted by male scholars to mean that a woman's testimony should always count for 1/2 of the value of a man's testimony. Contemporary reformers stress the socio-historical context in which the verse was revealed, a time when women were not active in business or finance, and a woman's expertise in these fields would most likely have been less than a man's. Others argue for women's free access to education, both secular and religious, so that they will be equal to men in a business environment, something that is not prohibited by the Quran. In light of women's right to own property and make their own investments, they say, this interpretation reflects broader Quranic values. And I noted earlier that in a country like Saudi Arabia, which in many ways is seen very conservative, women do own significant pieces of property, and women do function in a sexually segregated society, running their own corporations. Quranic interpretation is at the center of reformism. Some note that the Quran itself specifically distinguishes between 2 types of verses. And we'll hear this time and time again. Those that are universal principles and those that were responding to specific social and cultural contexts or questions and were subject to interpretation. They believe that those verses that assign greater rights to men, such as verses found in chapter 2, verse 223, and chapter 2, verse 228, reflect a patriarchal context in which men were dominant and solely responsible for supporting women. Today, rather than being interpreted literally, reformers argue that these verses should be reformulated to reflect changing socioeconomic conditions and the interests of public welfare. They further argue that gender equality is the intended order established by God, because God does not make distinctions based upon gender in matters of belief and morality. All are equally responsible in terms of belief and morality, and in terms of modest dress, for example. However, Muslims who advocate a literal interpretation of the Quran believe that the gender inequalities it prescribes apply to every time and place, as God's revealed social order. Biology is often used as a justification. Because only women can bear children, they argue, the man must provide for and maintain the family so that the woman can do her job of bearing and raising children. Gender inequality broadly exists in family law in women's restricted divorce rights, in contrast to men's extensive divorce and marriage rights in many regions, certainly in terms of modern standards. Reformers attempt to address this. Reformers maintain that the Quran and the Hadith literature support contemporary reinterpretation and reform in divorce laws. Particularly notable since the latter half of the 20th century across the Muslim world have been reforms in marriage and divorce laws, including the abolition or severe limitation of polygamy, expanded rights for women seeking divorce, including the right to financial compensation, expanded rights for women to participate in contracting their marriage, prohibitions with regard to child marriage, and expanding the rights of women to have custody over their older children. But this process remains contested and is rejected by more conservative Muslims. Look at gender segregation. The practice of separation has both religious and cultural origins. The Prophet's Medina did not practice sexual segregation. Although an integral part of the community, because of their special status, Muhammad's wives were told by the Quran O wives of the prophet, you are not like any other women. If you fear God, do not be complacent in speech, so that one in whose heart is a sickness may covet you, but speak honorably. Stay with dignity in your homes, and do not display your finery as the pagans of old did. Quran chapter 33, verses 32 to 33. The Quran later tells Muhammad's wives to place a barrier between themselves and unrelated males. Muslim men are told, and when you ask his wives for anything you want, ask them from before a screen. Here we're referring to Muhammad's wives. The Quran continues, that makes for greater purity for your hearts and for theirs. Chapter 33, verse 53. There have been many debates about how these verses concerned with modesty and segregation should be interpreted with respect to Muslim women in general. Modern reformers have pointed out that they specifically address only the wives of the Prophet rather than all of womankind. They maintain that until the modern age, jurists relied primarily on prophetic traditions, hadith, as well as the belief that women are a source of temptation for men to support women's segregation. In recent decades, more ultra-conservative, fundamentalist Muslim leaders have maintained that the verses addressing the wives of the Prophet apply to all Muslim women who are to emulate the behavior of Muhammad's wives. Opinions today vary about the necessity of separation of the sexes. While many believe that the absolute separation of the sexes is unnecessary, many others believe that modesty requirements can be met through appropriate dress and limiting interaction with unrelated males to conversations such as those concerning professional and educational matters, since men and women attend both work and school in mixed company. This holds true even in the religious realm, since women have come to play an important role in mosques, where they not only attend services and pray with men, but also teach Quran classes, run independent auxiliaries, and run for and hold elected offices. Indeed, in several Muslim countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Turkey, and Indonesia, women have been prime ministers or presidents. A new source of women's empowerment today has become their active participation in the mosque and their use of scripture and religion to reclaim their rights in Muslim societies. Reformers today emphasize that just as women during the time of the Prophet prayed in the mosque, so too today they actively exercise that right and should exercise that right. In the centuries after the death of Muhammad, women prayed regularly with men in the mosque and played a significant role as transmitters of hadith, prophetic traditions, and in the development of Sufism, Islamic mysticism. Women in the early Muslim community, like Khadijah, the wife of the Prophet, owned and sold property, engaged in commercial transactions, and were encouraged to seek and provide educational instruction. Many women were instructed in religious matters in Muhammad's own home. Muhammad's daughter, Fatima, his only surviving child, played a prominent role in his community. She was the wife of the Caliph Ali and the mother of the Imams Hussein and Hassan, seen as immaculate and sinless, the pattern for virtuous women, an object of prayer and petition. And articles have been written comparing her, by the way, to the role of the Virgin Mary in Roman Catholicism. Like her son Hussein, she embodies a life of dedication, suffering, and compassion. Muhammad's wife, Aisha, also played a unique role in the community as an acknowledged authority on history, medicine, poetry, and rhetoric, as well as one of the most important transmitters of hadith. In political affairs, women independently pledged their oath of allegiance to Muhammad. There was a form used, both in the time of Muhammad and also with the early caliphs. You acknowledged the ruler by an oath of allegiance, a bay'ah. They did this often without the knowledge or approval of male family members. And in many cases, distinguished women converted to Islam before the men in their family. The second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, appointed women to serve as officials in the marketplace of Medina. The Hanbali school of law, interestingly enough, often seen as among the most conservative schools of law, supports the right of women to serve as judges, something that in some modern Muslim countries still hasn't been implemented, although in many others it has. The Quran holds up the leadership of Bilqis, the Queen of Sheba, as a positive example in chapter 27, verses 23 to 44. Rather than focusing on gender, the Quranic account of this queen describes her ability to fulfill the requirements of her office, her purity of faith, her independent judgment, and her political skills, portraying a woman serving as an effective political leader. Gradually, however, women's religious role and practice, particularly their access to education and the mosque, was severely restricted. Male religious scholars cited a variety of reasons, from moral degeneration in society to women's bringing temptation and social discord, to restrict both their presence in public life and their access to education and to the mosque. The contemporary reality in much of the Muslim world reflects deep divisions in the ongoing struggle over the status and rights of women between conservatives and so-called fundamentalists versus a broad spectrum of reformers. As the examples of the Taliban's Afghanistan and legal cases in Nigeria and Pakistan reflect, patriarchal interpretations of the past and tribal custom have proven a formidable obstacle and a source of oppression and injustice. At the same time, in an increasingly modern, globalizing world, where two incomes are often necessary to maintain a household, Muslim women in many societies, from Egypt and Syria to Malaysia and Indonesia, have greater access to education and employment. And this trend is clearly one that's in place. However, the ability for this trend to develop will be affected not only by the impact, if you will, and the ongoing impact of patriarchy, but also, as is true of all religious traditions, the impact of the traditions of the past and the extent to which reform does occur or can occur. But a major obstacle will also remain economic development, which naturally has a significant effect on educational development. Lack of resources, economic resources, means often a lack of the proper schools, the proper curriculum, the ability to attract the right teachers, etc. Given the integral role of religion to Muslim societies, Islam's formative influence on gender relations in the past, and the impact of Islamic revivalism, religion continues to play a significant role as women forge new paths for themselves and future generations. As we've seen before, and as we shall see in our subsequent lecture, particularly in our final lecture on the future of Islam, this trajectory will continue. And part of the trajectory is not just a conflict between, if you will, modernizing, reform-minded, and conservative resistance to change. But the fact is, within those who are modern educated and reform-minded, today we see both your more secular, Western-oriented women and your more Islamically oriented women. And this can be seen most visibly in terms often of matters of dress. That is, you can have women in the workplace with the same educations, or in government, some wearing what one might call modern Western dress and some wearing Islamic dress, as well as in the mosques and in other sectors of society. In many ways, they reflect the broader dynamic that is playing out within Muslim societies today in terms of the issues of the relationship of Islam to modern reform, the relationship of past to present, and the ability to establish a continuity between the practice of today with the traditions of the past.